All right, so we're gonna start right away so we can maximize our hour. People may continue to join. I think most everyone here is familiar with Wellbeing Economy California, but super briefly, we're here to create awareness of the idea of centering well-being in decision making across politics and economy and in local communities. And how we go about doing that is what we're trying to collectively figure out together. And in that spirit, we've having this conversation between Sarah of Democracy Collaborative and John Nolte of Pomona Valley Wellbeing Project. And I'll let you two describe yourselves and take it from there, and I'll be quiet after that.
Sure. I think most people on the call that I can see know me and know this project, but just quickly, I'm John Nolte. I'm part of the Pomona Wellbeing Project. I'm also on the board of the Latino Roundtable, which is taking a big role in this project. And I am on the city council in Pomona, and have been interested in anchor institution collaboratives for a long time. I've followed the Cleveland model and the press around that, and some of the democracy collaboratives, a lot of the democracy collaboratives writings about it since about 2012 or so. And we're here because our project is kind of getting off the ground in the sense that the city of Pomona has dedicated some funding to what's called the Pomona Jobs Project, which in its inception is about creating an anchor institution collaborative. We've, in partnership with EcoCiv, the Institution for Ecological Civilization, are working on that project and also seeking other funding to broaden that project. And sort of at this moment of about to get started on a lot of things, we're really excited to have Sarah McKinley here from the Democracy Collaborative, given their long history in this type of a project. And so we'll be talking about anchor institution collaboratives and our specific questions regarding how to get started. But Sarah, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Great. Thanks so much, John. And thanks, David, for putting this together. It's wonderful to be in space with everyone here. I see some familiar faces and some familiar names. It was about a year ago, I was doing some research. It was May of 2022 that I presented with a group of you as well last year. So happy to be picking up this conversation. As John mentioned, I'm with the Democracy Collaborative. I focus on our community wealth building work in places, working in partnerships with collaboratives, with local governments, with anchor institutions and others to help deliver and implement community wealth building strategies in place. So that's the focus of my work. I've been with the Democracy Collaborative for 11 years, and I've been engaged in iterative and experimentation around community wealth building delivery in communities both in the US and in Europe and the UK. And so I hope that some of my learnings and observations and exchanges with these places that are doing the hard work in place can help you in your journey. Although I also know that you on the ground are the ones doing the real hard work. So I just want to preface that I bring my learnings from afar, but appreciate that you are the experts of your place and what's on the ground in Pomona and in your community, and that a lot of the answers and questions that we'll be discussing and the answers around them today will depend on the context of Pomona and particularly and specifically the assets and opportunities there. And I'm familiar with some of them, but certainly not most of them. And so I hope this can be a dialogue and learning exchange as well. And I look forward to actually supporting this work and bringing it into a broader network of places really experimenting with community wealth building and learning from one another on that. And let me just say, we're going to be focusing today specifically on anchor collaboratives and issues related to anchor collaboratives. But an anchor collaborative is just one part of a broader community wealth building strategy, which it does look across all aspects of a local economy, of which anchor institutions are a huge player because they help to shape and direct economic activity in place. So that's why we're looking specifically at anchors. And because there's already a wealth of activity, a wealth of assets in Pomona, today we're going to really be exploring and discussing how can we begin to pull in anchor institutions as partners to really leverage and maximize those assets for the benefit of the people living in Pomona. So without further ado, I'll pass it over and we can begin the conversation.
Yeah, so format wise, like we're intending to have basically a conversation around a series of questions between myself and Sarah, and you know, we've kind of shared some ideas about these questions, and we'll see where it goes from there. But hoping to bring her expertise a little bit to bear on the context of Pomona, understanding, like she says, that she'll have some questions for me as well to understand that better. We're at this point, Sarah, of being very close to wanting to really start to reach out to anchor institutions. We're talking about a regional project because the anchor institutions spread through the region. So they're not just in the city of Pomona, but they're in the surrounding cities as well. The Claremont colleges, I'm sure you're aware of. The hospital is in Pomona, but there's, other anchor institutions. And they've sort of heard that this is happening, but don't really know because we haven't done any systematic reaching out to them. So at this point where we're about to go to them, one of our questions is there like a pitch you would recommend or a way to approach them, a message, a story, language that tends to work when you're trying to bring anchor institutions into a project like this?
Absolutely. And so I'll start by saying that one of the terms we use often when working with anchor institutions is mutual self-interest, right? Understanding that most of these institutions, and by nature as anchor institutions that are rooted in place and have a mission of some kind to serve that place, be it health provision, education provision, service provision, things of that nature. Their success, their own well-being as an institution is dependent upon the well-being of the community in which they reside, right? So they're inherently linked in terms of their thriving, of their success, of their vibrancy. And so when we talk to anchor institutions, we usually approach them in that light, right? That we are working for the well-being of our community, and so are you. And so let's explore together how we do that together. And we can talk about that in extremely concrete terms, right? For example, if you're talking to a hospital or a healthcare institution, this well-being is a concrete, measurable thing, health and well-being. And their mission is to address that health. Usually they're dealing with it upstream, right? They're dealing with the consequences of ill health, right? But as most hospital systems know, the social determinants of health are actually much more impactful on people's actual health than clinical health, for example. So things like environment, social conditions, poverty, access to employment, things of that nature are much more impactful on people's well-being and good health than being able to access affordable healthcare, for example. Of course, that's important too. But if you can talk to hospitals about those social determinants of health, help them to understand that they can themselves as institutions address those social determinants of health upstream so they're not having to address them downstream, is a really great argument to make for them. It's both an argument in terms of fulfilling their mission. It's also an argument in terms of sort of understanding their bottom line and getting more bang for their buck, right? So we're not asking them to do something more. We're asking them to do better in their economic activities to support their mission upstream as well. And you can talk about these things in financial terms. You can say, lower poverty actually decreases emergency room visits, for example, things of that nature. More jobs, better paying, more resilient, more family sustaining jobs actually reduce ill health in communities that then reduce costs to institutions like health institutions. There are statistics on that can be shared. Similarly with higher education, universities, their campus safety, their campus well-being is inherently linked to the safety and well-being of the community. That's good for their students, that's good for their faculty, that's good for the kind of environment they're trying to foster for learning. And that has direct impacts on both who will come to their universities, who will come to their institution of higher education, as well as create benefits for the community. So that's a way in, and then what you have to do with that is then help those institutions to understand that they are economic actors in place, and that their economic activities impact all of these things that have effects on their bottom line as well. So that's a entry point, that's a pitch line, and it's a great place to start. And one way to bring that also is that this is not a sort of abstract concept. The idea of anchor institutions as good citizens in place, as viable and healthy economic actors in place is a growing movement. And there are many groups such as the Anchor Institution Task Force, for example, healthcare anchor networks, things of this nature that really are advancing these ideas at scale across the country. So it's not an obscure and strange idea. It's something that is part of a movement, and these institutions in Pomona should be getting on board with that if they want to be relevant in the current context of both our communities and the country.
Great, that makes a lot of sense. I'm in terms of approaching them. So in the region, Pomona Valley, I mean, we have a lot of anchor institutions, many colleges. We're considering also like the city governments and the school districts to be anchor institutions as well.
Absolutely. Lots
of different entities to bring together, and part of our hypothesis about this is that, you know, in the problems of poverty, inequality, you know, historic oppression, et cetera, tend to congregate in Pomona because the surrounding cities tend to be wealthy. Pomona tends to be a working class, lower income city. But, you know, we are going to need the cooperation of the region in order to solve these problems. So it's also partly about the region itself starting to recognize that we exist as one entity, and that Pomona's success redounds to the success of the region. So that's another reason to want to bring together anchor institutions as a way in a collaborative to start to see ourselves in the Pomona Valley as working together economically for the well-being of everybody. In terms of bringing this coalition together, you know, trying to get people to cooperate across institutions, do you think should we approach, I mean, do you have a sense of whether approaching them one at a time versus bringing all of them together into sort of like one meeting, let's say, or like a half day something or other? Like, what kind of approach have you seen work? Like, should we have delegations going to each institution with separate pitches, or bring everybody together? What's your thought about that kind of approach?
Well, both can work. And again, my response will be based on what is available and appropriate, and, for lack of a better term, opportunistic for you. What is the open door to work with? And, you know, I know we'll get into this about who is the best local convener. And by convener, it's not just someone who has the ability to bring together. It's sort of the neutral party. A lot of times institutions don't necessarily play well together. So part of the challenge is, you know, this healthcare network doesn't necessarily want to work with this hospital over here. So who's the neutral party that can bring them together? And then also, who has a bully pulpit that can force or encourage, I should say, cajole in a friendly way, institutions to come together and move together. So that's a question about the landscape. What I will say, though, is just in terms of capacity, right? I know everybody has multiple hats here. John, you're a city councilor, you're with a Latina roundtable, you're doing a million things. A lot of people don't have time to have delegations and individual engagements with each institution, at least at this point in the game. So often an easier way to begin is to have that one-stop shop, what we call an anchor institution roundtable. Bring as many of the anchor institution players together as you possibly can with that neutral convener. And that convener could be could be a community foundation. It could be the local government. It could be what we call a community backbone organization, potentially the Latino Roundtable, if they have that clout and respect in the community at that level. It depends. It will depend on your context, but having that roundtable and then bringing in others to that roundtable is often helpful. Others from outside the region, people who come in with a perspective that doesn't carry the baggage of the institutions in that room, the potential trust relationships the institutions may have or not with the community. Those kinds of players, not only can you learn from them, but they set a groundwork. They set a level that it becomes an expectation that other places are doing this, other places can do this, and Pomona not only should be no different, but also Pomona could do more and do better and move beyond. So that might be a great way to start. The Democracy Collaborative could be one of those players to come in and be kind of an external party, but there are other organizations, other examples from across the country, near and far, Greater California as well, that could come in and play that role as well. So there are ways to design that in a way that brings institutions to the table and pushes them forward in a one-stop shop. Now, you'll probably have to follow up with relationships from there, but it's a great way to start, and you don't have to do all that groundwork at the front end.
Yeah, and it might be, and I think I'm hearing it's kind of a question of strategy based on where we're at. One thing that where we're at is we have this jobs project that's funded through the COVID funding that the city of Pomona received. Yeah. Part of that is to create or find or connect low-income Pomona residents to good-paying, family-supporting local jobs. And that's sort of the part that's funded, and then the other part is to get the anchor institutions to be the ones who help us create and fund those jobs. And so that having that project gives us like a way to approach them. That we have this need in the community for jobs, and we're going to one thing we might ask, or that we're intending to ask the anchor institutions, is to help us with the hiring of these individuals into their anchor institutions. So, I mean, that is sort of like low-hanging fruit to bring them together around this idea of job creation. And then we're hoping that through that, we can get them bought in as well to this larger project of collaboration and continuing on. Is that, like, just in general, does that sound like an approach that could work?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent strategy. This is a commitment that the city has already committed to, and now it has to deliver and follow through. And so you're asking for their participation in that. And I think it is a great way to open the door and to get them interested. There are many examples of things like good jobs charters, things like that, commitments that institutions have to sign on to. And it sounds like the Pomona's Jobs Project is a way to begin to do that. We talk about anchor charters, of which that's just a part, right? It's a commitment that institutions sign on to around hiring, around purchasing, around local investment, around land use strategies, things of that nature. But that's a good start. If you already have a commitment to hire X number of people locally, you can begin with that. And there are really good examples. And so let me step back for a second and just say, you said you're thinking of the local government and the school board as anchor institutions. Absolutely. In fact, one of the biggest and best examples of an anchor institution is local government. So don't underestimate the power of setting example by your own practice, right? And for local government to be the first to sign on to that charter, we are going to hire X number of people from these communities in Pomona. Oh, and we're going to work with local workforce development servicers to create a jobs training program that actually skills them and makes them ready for the kinds of jobs and the specific needs that we have as an institution, and begin to develop what we call those pipelines of employment that actually create specific skills, that build specific skills, that support trainees not just to enter the institution job market, but then to actually grow and advance and perform within it. So really using local government not only to set the example, but also to create the conditions that will make it easier also for institutions to follow through on their commitments. Because often you'll hear from institutions, oh, well, we can't find people with these kinds of skills locally. Okay, well, what are the skills that you need, and how can we work with local workforce development training programs to develop those? And there's an excellent example called Step Up to Employment in Cleveland that was part of the work of the Evergreen Cooperatives and the Cleveland collaboration with anchor institutions. And that's just one of many examples. So I think that's a great place to start. And I think it's important for local government to model that behavior in their own commitments and their own follow through and the way that they create space and ecosystem to support this kind of connectivity in the job market.
Yeah, I like that. That's a great idea to maybe have local governments. I mean, particularly being on the city council of Pomona, I mean, it makes me think that, we've committed to this project. Should we be the first to commit to what we're asking the anchor institutions to do, including ourselves? The idea that we have, a lot of people from different, particularly, surrounding communities who are part of our well-being group who could, work with their own city governments to be part of, that kind of commitment. That's a good idea. Okay, let's see. A question is, and the group that we're working with, most of us are, say, like, well, I'm an activist and now a politician, and we've got a lot of activist type people, a lot of nonprofit type people. This move from the nonprofit world into the anchor institution world feels intimidating to me. I'll put it out there. I wrote this question, and to a lot of people, it's like, like they seem big, wealthy, highly organized. What are your tips to help? Like, how can we feel more comfortable moving into that space and being confident about approaching them and what we're doing? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, not to be flippant, but I would also say that sometimes these spaces are designed precisely to make you and others and communities feel that way, right? We are the experts, you are not. I don't mean to belittle that feeling, because it's very true, and you feel it yourself. But I think one thing to keep in mind is that we're all products in the structure and system that we're in, and so people within anchor institutions themselves don't know what they don't know, right? And so again, to that sort of point about mutual self-interest, what do I bring to the table? What can I bring to the table that these institutions may not know or may not be aware of, that can help them to advance not only in their mission to serve, but also in being good civic partners in this space and in our community. So I think coming with a spirit of, I know what I don't know. I'm not an expert in your procurement or finance activities, but I am an expert in my community. I am an expert in the needs of particular populations, of particular groups, and how can I help you to better understand that space so that we can move together to addressing issues, going back to, we're all in this together, addressing issues that affect all of us and affect your institution, certainly. So I think coming in that spirit is one way to do it. I think, I think, again, coming with the knowledge, arming yourself of the knowledge of other places are doing this, other examples of which there are collaborations between anchor institutions and communities, This isn't a crazy demand. This isn't a radical storming of the gates. This is something that is part of good community stewardship and action and what we need in this moment of crises and so forth. So I think really coming in that spirit is also powerful. And then again, especially for yourself, John, and for others, what are you doing that leads by example, right? What is the city? How is the city setting the example and the tone for institutions to follow, right? And other groups as well. How are we, putting our money where our mouth is? And I think coming into that space with your own commitments to do the work as well is also important. It makes it feel as though we're, again, we're all in this together. We're not saying you bad, us good, vice versa. This is something we're working on together and we're problem solving together, and it's important. And I know that provost of Claremont colleges really cares about our community too, right? I mean, that's a way to begin the conversations. And then, and don't be intimidated. It's easier said than done. I appreciate that. But here I work in the space of economy. I'm not an economist. It's easy to be intimidated by sort of the professionalization of spaces that we should all be engaged in. But we have to remind ourselves that this is something that impacts everybody, and therefore everybody has a right to be making requests and pushing for a more collaborative and connected space where we all can work together.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that makes sense. So I want to move a little bit. So
I'm sorry. I just thought,
sure.
and never hesitate to pull in examples where they can hear it from other people like themselves, right? Oh, okay, you might not be able to hear it from me, but you might be able to hear it from another hospital CEO or another provost at University of Pennsylvania, for example. So I'm just opening the door, and I can offer you some examples and connections in spaces that you might be able to hear it from.
Yeah, good point. I was actually thinking that too. I'm glad you'd said that earlier about it's not like this is something that hasn't been done before, isn't part of a more broad movement where other anchor institutions are already doing this. So this is a little bit like you talked about. What reminded me of this is talking to the provost, and some of our initial outreaches will probably be people like that, higher executives. One thing we're interested. This group has been talking a lot about the Cleveland model and about moving from basically wanting to replicate or do something along those lines, where we get to the point where the demand stream of the anchor institutions is being combined. We're figuring out which business types, they're spending their money on, which ones are available to take those streams and combine them and create, businesses that can be successful because of the demand of the anchor institutions, and preferably, hopefully, working toward creating worker cooperatives that are connected, to the anchor institutions and to each other, and that are successful because they are relying on that demand. That's sort of the whole, ecosystem that Cleveland is about. How do you get from, one question that's come up is like, you're talking to the provost, but it's really the purchasing people, like they're the ones that you really have to get to. How do you get from this sort of mission we've been talking about, getting the anchor institutions on board, but really getting to those purchasers, the people who make those decisions? How does that step happen, and how can we get there?
Well, first, let me say, it sounds like you're already doing all the right things, the landscape analysis, or what we call a gap analysis, understanding where the spending may or may not be going, and what you have in your local economy in terms of enterprise to address demand, and where you can start to match make or connect across that line of demand. So it sounds that you're already thinking in the right direction. And I'll also say that, I love the studying of Cleveland. It's a great model. And I also think that there can be a Pomona model. How can you do more and better and beyond the Cleveland model? And in many ways, you sort of already are by using your ARP money to instigate, incentivize certain aspects of that. And by coming together with a really robust community backbone organization like the Latino Roundtable. So it sounds like you're already putting things in play that can actually springboard or advance things much more quickly and potentially even more holistically than Cleveland. The work in Cleveland is quite powerful, but it's also a very focused neighborhood strategy. And it's great that you're already thinking at the regional level how to connect these other places to Pomona more intentionally, and what that means in terms of regional economics and economic strategy. So first I'll say that, and then I'll say that problem you just articulated is entirely common and happens everywhere. That you may be able to get the CEO or the provost or the leaders and executives on board, but there's a whole level of behavioral change and practice renegotiating among the people, the professionals who actually have to make those commitments real. And that is indeed a challenge. So first I'll say it certainly helps to have the support of those high level executives and leaders, right? Because they set the tone, they set the commitments, they can create that direction. So that's the carrot, and then you have to make or you have to help the actual worker bees deliver, and that's not always easy because they have a day job, they have been trained to think and act a certain way, they're good at their jobs, and it will feel very much as though they're having to pivot and relearn and do things anew, and that's not always easy or fun. So first of all, I'll say when you get to that point, it's really important to have training. So to work directly with procurement officers on the kinds of things that they can do. For example, breaking up contracts into smaller bids rather than a huge, 10,000 unit bid or something like that will have to be serviced by a large contractor or multinational. So digging into the precise strategies and ways that those officers can begin to think differently and change their behavior around this. So the trainings, but particularly from associations related to their field. So procurement officers learning from other procurement officers, hiring teams, HR teams learning from other HR teams, things of that nature, and connecting into other places that are doing this. So for example, connecting to procurement officers at the Cleveland Clinic who have started to actually redirect large amounts of their procurement contracts to the local cooperatives, learning from them, having a chance to dialogue and exchange around that. And again, networks like the Healthcare Anchor Network, for example, can help connect into those sorts of things. There's a group called ASHI, which is the Association for, it's a higher education association for finance and procurement officers, things like that can actually help to think differently for those people who are really doing the work of behavioral change.
And so you get to that point, and then I guess you're just talking about training from people who are already doing it through these networks. Am I thinking about that right? Like you can
training, discourse, having a place to go ask questions, things like that. Again, making it seem like they're not alone in changing their behavior, changing the way that they operate, and that there are other ways to do it that aren't necessarily entirely difficult, that might just mean breaking up a contract or putting out a smaller bid or things of that nature. And I mean, there are a lot of these things very specific to, so for example, minority purchasing commitments. A lot of institutions and local governments have to meet a certain criteria of women and minority-owned business purchasing, and there are some very sophisticated ways specifically around that for constructing contracts and doing matchmaking or putting out bids to specific small businesses. But how can we repurpose a lot of those tools? So for example, your Chamber of Commerce, your small business development group, how can you reuse those existing resources to actually help connect to cooperative opportunities, for example, social enterprise opportunities, other kinds of enterprises within that. So retooling those resources that will also support those professionals at that level as well when they're trying to build this capacity.
Do you, so like there's what you're talking about here leads to some of the other questions we have, which are, like there's the idea of creating businesses from scratch, for example, where and then there's so let's say like that's kind of like in Cleveland, the laundry, for example, hey, we're all using laundries, but we could create a laundry and all of us use that one instead. Then there's this other, the idea that there are businesses in the community. You were talking about the Chamber of Commerce, and can we help to direct the anchor institutions to use local businesses? Are there like criteria that would help us analyze local businesses to be the ones that we would want to connect to anchors? How do we know which ones to choose, which ones to look for, which industries to be in? How does that conversation go typically? Or do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, certainly there are what in Europe and the UK they call social value frameworks that sort of assess businesses on their delivery on certain social issues, like how many people receive living wage, how many people are able to support a family off of this job, how many opportunities for advancement do they have. So criteria that look at the conditions of employers and enterprises. And then even there are certification programs for some of those. You might not want to go that far, but you can find those criteria that you can then assess local enterprises, local employers on those terms. That's something, again, that, using your small business development center or your business improvement district or your Chamber of Commerce to assist on those sorts of things. They'll have lists of enterprises, and often they'll have sort of some criteria around those. Many places, especially local governments, will have certain set requirements. They cannot, for certain kinds of sectors, they have to employ union specific jobs, for example. They have to purchase from groups that their supply chain also purchases either made in the USA or local or something like that. So there will be kind of existing criteria for some institutions already based on sort of their parent requirements and expectations, for example. And of course, local government can set some of those requirements for themselves as well in terms of contracting. And then especially for local government, there's a certification process for contractors that are responding to local bids. That often tends to be a barrier to entry for smaller and cooperative enterprises because, as one can imagine, it has a massive amount of bureaucracy and paperwork to actually be satisfied as one of those confirmed bidding enterprises. So working at ways to lower that barrier to entry, reduce the burden of that bureaucracy, but make it easier for local and cooperative enterprises to actually be able to certify themselves or become contract ready, if you will. For example, the city of Chicago, in their local contracts division, they have, right now it's only one, hopefully there'll be more, but they have a staff person whose job it is to go out to local small businesses, BIPOC enterprises, cooperative enterprises, to inform them and then help them understand and apply for this kind of certification so that they can bid for those contracts. So those kinds of supports are a way to move that along as well. And then another opportunity is creating a lot of places we've worked with before, create kind of matchmaking opportunities, almost like speed dating, if you will, where they bring together local enterprises and local institutions to explore their fit for these kinds of purchasing and contractual relationships.
Cool. I sometimes when I hear, some examples like Chicago or Cleveland and et cetera, like one difference here is this multi-city, aspect of it. So it's like the cross-border nature of it that both I think makes it exciting, but also complex, right? If we want to change or to get a handle on what these requirements that you're talking about, I mean, each institution is going to have different ones, and it's going to be a matter of like getting information, getting people to share information, and kind of, it seems to me like a puzzle, right? Like we have like all these different regulations we have to understand, the funding, the purchasing streams, the different bureaucracies. The way I'm thinking about it is for that to work, it really seems like this backbone organization type thing is going to be critical. Like that's going to happen out of the neutral place that can bring everybody together, and that that place will have to, in other words, like you if you had a department at the city of Pomona, for example, doing it, that would be great, but they're going to be focused on the city of Pomona, right? And we need the focus to cross over into Claremont and San Dimas and the cities around us. And so having sort of an infrastructure that is regional seems important in our context. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that. I mean, do you think that makes sense, and that's probably, if we want it to be collaborative and regional, it's going to have to be like a regional backbone kind of a thing that has that capacity? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It absolutely makes sense. I don't know that the Pomona backbone necessarily has to be that regional body, but it has to have relationships with regional actors. So first of all, I think there's a really important role for the county of Los Angeles, the greater Los Angeles County, to play in this, to bring together a lot of these other jurisdictions that directly impact as well your local conditions. So I think certainly there's a role for the county, and then of course that makes groups like Wellbeing Economy Alliance California really important to advocate for certain state level changes as well, and state level supports for this kind of activity as well, because certainly you cannot do this work in a vacuum. But you can focus on what you're more readily able to control. And I would say sort of having a backbone structure within Pomona that can then liaise or have connectivity or have representation with those additional regional and statewide bodies, I think is a place to start. So for example, an advisory board. So for example, the city of Chicago, for their community wealth building initiative, which by the way, they've now they've empowered a local community wealth building ecosystem center that will be separate from the city, but the city will directly support it with funding through ARP and other things, that has a full-time staff, and that staff will be managing advisory council that includes not only local institution actors and local community-based organizations, leaders, and activists, but also city officials and county officials as well, so that they can actually have that space where all of those groups are coming together. So there are ways to think of it as sort of tiers and levels, but start where you can. Start with that Pomona-based backbone institution that may or may not be within city government or supported by city government in another entity like the Latina Roundtable, and then tier that out through governance, through an advisory board, through quarterly connectivity meeting, things of that nature that you can start to institutionalize in other ways more broadly, but start where you can. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So if you,
and just to say, there is so the County of Los Angeles, I think, is quite interested in supporting these things and doesn't know how. And so I think there's a lot of that kind of energy. Yes, we want to do this. How do we do this, right? I see in the chat that Santa Monica is doing some things. So what are other places that are doing this, and how can you come together to then start to show how to the county and to give them a way to come in and get on board? So I think, and similarly with the state, right? I think there's good intent, there's interest, there's desire, but how the heck do we do this? What's our role? And I think by showing and giving an opportunity for that is very powerful.
yeah, and I think that there's a lot of feeling here in our group that's the stage we're at. Like it's this like tension between, we want to be told how to, I mean, just like anybody, you want to be told how to do it, but nobody knows how to do it really. And I mean, you just have to kind of, make the road that you're going to walk on. And I think that we are at that point. I think we're at a good point to do that. I think your ideas, like, for example, bringing in this county aspect, I think is one that is something that could be really important here that maybe we haven't talked about it as much, but thinking about that and some of these other groups in the county. But I really do think, when you talk about things like an advisory board, and I mean, for me, that's, essentially the same idea as maybe the Anchor Collaborative itself. What the structure of this will look like is something that we're just going to have to build as we build it and we see how things turn out. But I'm wondering, like you talked about, for example, in Chicago, having a place with a staff and things like that. Just, I don't know if you have any sense of this, just to give us a sense, like I'm thinking 3 to 5 years out, like if this was working, like, do you have a sense of like what kind of staff we would be required to run this? How we would know if it was successful? Like help me think I know you don't know everything about the context, but from what you do know, 3 to 5 years from now, what might this look like if it was working and successful? And particularly like in terms of like, how is it staffed and how many people are working full time on it, if you have a sense of how things have worked elsewhere.
Yeah, and again, it looks different in every place, which is both the frustration, but also the sort of joy and journey of this work. And I'll also just say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You just need to, as you said, you're kind of putting the wings on as you fly, and sometimes you just need to jump. And so, and that's the scary part, but you're near to it for sure. I would say, to begin with, at some point you need to have a staff person, someone who owns this and is responsible to delivery, following through, making sure that anchor institutions are signing on to this charter, are able to liaise with the city to understand what resources are available. This person could be in the city and is that something that can come out of the ARP fund? I know most of that has been allocated, but things like that. I don't know if folks saw, but just actually last night, the White House released a press release on sort of its support for community-based development activities, including support for community wealth building activities. So I think we're going to see more sort of funds coming to local governments, local communities to support this kind of work. So how can you use those sorts of things to provide staff and infrastructure to this. So one person to start, 2 to 3, and then it's not just about creating a whole nother mechanism. It's using what you have already. There's an economic development department within Pomona or something to that extent. How can you redirect and repurpose activities and staff within that department to be focusing on this kind of work, which in fact is sort of under the remit of economic development, community development, those things. So what already exists, how can that be redirected? Planning staff, the regional economic development authorities offices will have to have people that are thinking about job creation. Well, how can they be doing it with a lens for community wealth building, with a lens to creating pipelines for employment within, from democratic enterprises to local institutions, things of that nature. So how can you retool those existing institutional assets in your place to be thinking about this, rather than creating another sort of system that sits on top? It's about redirecting the resources, the capacity that already exists to be focusing on that. And in some ways that feels like a harder ask, but it doesn't require new resources, right? It will at first, because there'll be training, there'll be engagement, there'll be infrastructure building, but ultimately that's the direction of travel, that all of this existing infrastructure needs to be focused in a different direction. And that's the goal. So I would say success in the near term is 1 to 2 staff people whose job it is to go out and find those spaces, those people, and begin to do the trainings, the engagements, the resource connectivity to redirect the behavior and the practice in the direction that we need it to be going.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense, and we're we're in that, moving in that direction. We certainly have this jobs project, which has some definite staff time. I do think we're going to need additional staff, and we're seeking that as well. Let's see, we have got like 7 minutes left. We've got a few questions that we haven't gotten to. Let me just give me a second to look and see if I think there's a I know that maybe we can get to 2 more things. One is just, I know there's a lot of interest in our wealth building groups that meet a lot about the creation of cooperatives. Are there like certain types of co-ops that are working well with anchor institutions? What are you seeing around that?
So first of all, foundational services, for example, cooperatives that provide foundational economic needs. So for example, laundry was one example, specifically to hospitals, but it's a big need for hotels and other things of that nature. But things like infrastructure maintenance, groundskeeping, cleaning services, these are foundational services that every community needs, institutions very much need, and that can't be something that you send out or outsource somewhere else. So it has to be done locally. So thinking about those foundational jobs, that foundational economy, and how that can be turned into a more cooperative democratic space. And of course, some of the biggest cooperatives that we have in the country are those kinds of cooperatives: care providers, cleaning services, wastewater management, and then finally thinking about also those services, those enterprises that are integral for our green transition, right? That's a key way to be thinking about how you democratize work, how you democratize enterprise by the transition that we need. So I mentioned wastewater management, green wastewater management, green infrastructure development, solar projects, for example, retrofitting, housing, winterization and weatherization, things of that nature are huge sectors for cooperatives, for creating democratic enterprise.
Yeah, I think it's probably those of us who've been working on this, a lot of those things that you're saying are the things that we've been discussing. And so it's good, I think we are thinking about that, if we want anchor institutions, I mean, they all do landscaping, they all, have needs for food, for example. So we're looking a lot also toward urban farming. Okay. Let's see what, in terms of, we do need funding to keep this going. What sources of, I know you mentioned, for example, that the federal government is looking at putting some resources toward community wealth building. Are there other funding sources that you think of that we ought to be seeking out?
Well, it's both infuriating and exciting. There's no shortage of money. There's tons of money. It's just where is it going and how do we get it, right? And so that is the question. And so starting first is, what do you have locally? Is there a community foundation? And community foundations in particular have to serve the community now. They tend to sort of be looking at cultural things and things of that nature, very important, but how can they be thinking of those things through a lens of democratizing economies, democratizing opening things up to community control. So community foundations, great places to start. I think with institutions, as you start to build a institution network, looking at sort of commitments from those institutions to support some of this work. There are models for that. They do ante up. It is possible. And so that's one, generally smaller, you're not going to get huge amounts, but then also looking at these institutions' endowments, these are things that are already being invested. How and where are they being invested? And how can you have that dialogue around that investment needs to support the work that they're doing as a community serving institution, not be counter to it, which often a lot of these investments are, especially in the context of divestment from fossil fuels and other things. Where is that money being reinvested, and ensuring that it's being reinvested into local institutions, local infrastructure, community development, financial institutions, revolving loan funds, things of that nature that can help support this work on the ground. Similarly with pension funds, that's another huge opportunity. If the city can look at their own pension funds, what does that look like? Where is it going? And how can it be redirected in more powerful ways?
We also have a public banking movement that's happening in the region as well. I mean, these are sort of longer term things, but yeah, I mean, those are great suggestions. Lastly, the Democracy Collaborative itself, what are your capacities right now to help support us, like if we wanted to engage the Democracy Collaborative?
Well, like everyone, we don't have as much capacity as we'd like, but we're working on that, certainly. First of all, I'll say we are in the process of building a network of places, local governments and collaborative efforts that are pursuing community wealth building. So we'd love to have Pomona be a part of that. That would include places like Chicago and Cleveland, but other places as well at different scales, to have this space to iterate and learn from one another and exchange resource and so forth. So that's one sort of thing. We hope to have that going sometime at the end of the fall or winter of 23-24. So that's one way. Advisory services, advising, in sitting on an advisory board, lending expertise or connectivity where we can, in a more formal way. And then we also do, which sounds like you're already beginning to do, landscape analyses, so we can come in and help sort of talk to different institutional actors, talk to different leaders at different levels. We conduct an appreciative inquiry process that helps to map out existing activities and then provide recommendation for how to fill gaps and what to do with opportunities and challenges in the landscape. So different levels, but happy to discuss any of those, and just really want to support this effort and all the work that you're already doing.
Well, great. Thank you so much for all of your advice here. I think we've got a lot to think about. There were some really good things that I think, we hadn't necessarily been thinking of, and I feel more confident now. A lot of times it's just a matter of taking the next step and pushing the envelope. And I'm really glad you can see the people on this call. Lots of them are very anxious to do that. So we just keep moving forward. And hopefully we'll have many opportunities in the future to work with you as we do so. So thanks very much, Sarah. I appreciate it.
Well,
Yeah.
thank
David,
you,
I don't
and
know
thank
if
you
had
all
any
for the
final
work.
words. Yeah.
I'll just say
you
thank
so
you.
much, Sarah. I mean, this was amazing. Unfortunately, I have a lot of construction noise from my neighbor in the background, so I'll keep it brief. But I'm so glad we ended up recording this because there was so many nuggets. I couldn't have written them down fast enough. So how great that we can rewatch it and rediscuss it as a team, and also share it with other cities that are thinking about doing this work. So just really grateful how supportive and how much of a cheerleader you've been in helping us get this done and spread the message on it so we can have it happen in more places.
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for attending too and listening in. Sorry it wasn't so much of a conversation today, but I'm sure we'll do that in the future. And many of us, I'm sure, will go back and rewatch this for guidance. So thanks very much.
John, I included in the chat, that I think it would be good to have a future discussion like this. We just met with Rosa Marta Zarate, who's doing cooperatives in San Bernardino. So a lot of the discussion here seemed to me to be at the treetops. And you did relate to the issue of knowledge and then not intimidation and how you do that. And a methodology, I think, that is very important in this is how do we get consolidation, not only both at the treetop, but certainly at the grassroots? And how do we use horizontal relationships, like popular education, for example, the language of the people, in terms of doing that? And I really think we need more discussion on that. Otherwise, it gets just on the level of the professional part and working with these anchor institutions at the treetops, and we forget that each institution has, like the roundtable, has grassroots people that we need to bring this to, and we need to consolidate it. I just want to add, I recently talked to someone from Mondragon who Rose and my wife is connected here. We went to Mondragon in Spain, and of course, all of Mondragon is cooperatives, everything from banks to the schools, everything. And they mentioned one thing that they tried, or they're trying in Mexico City to do the same thing they did in Mondragon. And they're having real problems. And the first problem they ran into is that they realized that in Mondragon, they had a whole history of people who were consolidated around cooperatives. So they didn't even have to deal with that. People just moved on it. When they went to Mexico City and they tried to implement it, there were people who didn't have that consciousness. And right away, what they wanted was better pay than another one. And it created so many conflicts. And then they realized we have to go back and do this knowledge education with, they call it people's knowledge, with both the grassroots and the anchor in order even to get it going. And unless we, I think, do that, and we just focus, let's say, on the treetops and not on this, how do we get this to the people themselves, and what method do we have, we may get into problems. So I just wanted to share that.
Thanks,
That's a really important point, Jose, and I don't mean to drag it on, but I'll just say to note with Mondragon, Mondragon started with a school, a local school. That's actually what it started with. And then the second institution it built was a bank. So first it was educate people and then get money, get capital and root it locally, right? That's how Mondragon started. And so one of the problems with replicating Mondragon in a lot of places is they don't start from that point, from education and then rooting capital. So they're starting in a different way. Anyways, it's I can stay on for a few minutes, but I won't. I know I want to respect people's time, but great point. And you have to do both at the same time. You have to be able to do grass tops, grass bottoms, and the middle. Actually, a lot of what's missing is the middle. So it's not easy work, but it sounds like you're thinking about all the right things.
Yeah. That's definitely been part of the consistent conversation we have. Even the way we're structuring the 2 employees that we're working on hiring is related to what we call grass tops and grassroots, and bringing those sides together, I think, is why the Latino Roundtable is such a key partner and place for Backbone, because it does have, it forms a bit of that middle. It kind of is a organization that has that central location. All right. Well, I don't know, David. I think this is you're going to have to be the one that presses end. So
no problem. Yeah, no, I think we're good. Thank you so much, and hopefully we'll see you again soon, Sarah, which I know we will.
Thank you.
All right.
Talk to you soon.